What I mean by that is, well, this is a disjunction. So we're either unreliable at truth, finding truth. And what I mean by that is we're unreliable at finding not like deep philosophical truths, but like everyday truths. We're like very unreliable. And the second disjunct, we're unreliable at validity. And by that, I mean, I don't mean that we're unreliable at spotting validity in like really complicated arguments. I mean like really simple arguments, the type of arguments you give when you're teaching predicate logic. Okay. And then I'll give some ideas on which of these is worse and which of these is better. Okay, so I'm going to start with, here's section 1, common sense philosophy and the Moorean move. Very roughly speaking, this is what I'm going to be arguing for. I'm going to talk about common sense, what I mean by that term. I'm going to be focusing on philosophical arguments against common sense. Okay? So if someone gives you a philosophical argument that says, that concludes that you don't have a brain, okay, that's a philosophical argument against common sense. And the Moorean move is when you look at the argument and you say, you know what, the conclusion is false, okay, because I have a brain. So there's a mistake in the argument somewhere. That's what I call the Moorean move. And roughly put, what I'm going to do is say that some of these philosophical arguments are probably successful, and the Moorean move is not a reasonable way to proceed in philosophy. Either that's true, or the point about validity is true. Okay, so that's enough stage setting. Okay, by commonsensical claims, I mean roughly, virtually every adult who understands it well would accept it. More specifically, I've got in mind claims like these in particular. And now these are not all the same, okay? So there are trees on Earth, some people are rich. We know that there are trees in the backyard, 2 + 2 = 4. So those are claims from like everyday common sense, okay? But then we have some more complicated ones, like modus ponens is truth preserving, applied to ordinary sentences of natural language. Contradictions aren't true. And then the last one is the most complicated one. There are no two entirely material objects occupying the same place, same time, meaning the exact same matter. Okay. Now, I made this list in a very particular way, which I'll get to later. Okay. But you can see that these are not all equally commonsensical, right? I mean, some of these are really, really commonsensical. Like, you know, some people are rich, 2 + 2 = 4. And then the latter ones are not nearly as commonsensical. Okay? In fact, you can, I'm thinking of commonsensical in a way of like taking a poll of people and saying, you know, do you agree with this, yes or no? And you know, you could get higher values, you know, 99% versus 93%. And then also there's the number of people that actually understand the claims. Like most people outside of philosophy don't know what a contradiction is. So, but you know, we do, all right? All right, so these, I made this list by considering philosophical arguments against common sense. Each one of these is a claim of common sense that's denied by certain famous philosophical arguments. Okay, so now my next phrase, attempted philosophical reductives of common sense. What I have in mind are philosophical arguments with only commonsensical premises and the negation of a commonsensical claim as conclusion. So this is not all philosophical arguments against common sense. It's ones like you see in the liar paradox, the paradox of the heap, the Sorites paradox, certain paradoxes in logic and Faustian language and metaphysics, claims, arguments like that, where each premise looks just obviously correct, and yet they seem to entail the denial of some commonsensical claim. So that's what I mean by attempted philosophical reductives of common sense. And, oh, I just said this. These can be constructed from certain philosophical problems. The Sorites paradox, the statue-clay problem, the tip problem, problem of the many, the liar paradox, Curry's paradox, and a bunch of others. Okay? And you can just continue this list. I just chose philosophy of logic and metaphysics. But you can just keep going. I mean, I read one recently in Applied Ethics about the distribution of resources, or something like that. So there's just tons of these arguments, okay? All right, so one question is like, how many arguments are there like this? Okay, that's a question I'm going to get to in a minute. Okay, so now I'm going to explain what I mean by the Moorean move. Suppose you encounter what you know to be a philosophical argument that goes against common sense. So it has to be philosophical, not something that's just scientific. And I know, there's no sharp line between the two, but it doesn't matter. Okay, it doesn't matter. here is one epistemically rational thing to do, at least initially anyway. You retain your commonsensical belief, which is against the conclusion, and you conclude that the argument is unsound. And you can do this independently of finding specific fault in the argument, even though you might have some ideas about where the fault lies. So I give you an argument I give you the liar paradox, okay? The first time you've seen the liar paradox. And I can formulate it as an argument, and the conclusion is, such and such a contradiction is true. And you look at it and you say, well, contradictions aren't true. So there's a mistake in the argument somewhere. That's the Moorean move. It's an inference. It's a cognitive move you make in a reaction to an argument. And we do this type of thing all the time. Okay? We do this type of thing all the time. And we don't do it just in philosophy. We do it in science. We do it in all sorts of things. When I was in high school, I came up with a proof that all triangles are isosceles. And I was like, this is perfect. But I knew the conclusion's false, because not all triangles are isosceles. But, I couldn't find the mistake. But I did the Moorean move. I was like, well, my conclusion of my proof is wrong, so there's a mistake in my argument, but I can't find it. Okay? The best example of this, by far, in the universe, okay, is there is an argument in physics, and you can YouTube this, that says, and the conclusion is this, that the sum of the positive integers is negative 1/12. That's not a joke, okay? And then there are some physicists, I think there's one at the University of Birmingham in England, and some other physicists in England. They really think the sum of the positive integers is negative 1/12. And they have a proof of it, and guess what? There's a mistake in it, okay? Because they're using the word add or the word sum in a weird way. But anyway, this is the type of thing where somebody gives you an argument, and you look at the conclusion, you know it's false. So you know there's a mistake somewhere, even if you can't find it. Okay, so that's the Moorean move. And I don't know about you, but I think just about everybody in philosophy does this sometimes. We all do this sometimes. Okay? Many of us do it with regard to the radical skeptic. We say, look, I do know I have two hands, so there's a mistake in the skeptic's argument, and we just have to figure out where it is. Okay, so that's the Moorean move. Now I'm going to present the thesis of my talk. And like I said, it's a disjunction, so I'm going to go over each disjunct. Here is the first disjunct. It's highly probable that some attempted philosophical reductios of common sense are successful, in the sense that they're sound arguments. Okay? And we can no longer make the Moorean move reasonably. Okay? So the first disjunct has two parts. Okay? Then the second disjunct. We are unreliable at spotting validity and invalidity in our philosophical arguments, even for the ones that seem utterly straightforward. So when you write a paper, and you're being all careful and perfect in your arguments, and you're like, okay, I'm going to number all my premises, and I check it, and I say, okay, it's a valid argument. I've got it all down. I'm being a rigorous analytic philosopher today, right? No, okay? According to this disjunct, we, all of us, are highly unreliable in spotting validity. Right? Even when it looks really simple, you're like, this is like modus ponens. Okay, so this is my thesis that I'm going to be arguing for. Now, in order to do it, okay, so this is about attempted philosophical reductios. So I'm going to use the Sorites paradox just as an example to illustrate this. Okay, so this is the paradox of the heap. Now, I don't have time to go over all this stuff. This isn't a talk on the Sorites paradox. But I just want you to look at these claims very briefly. So I'm calling these the Sorites claims, and there's 1,000,002,000 of them. Okay? Let's just look at like the first one. For any x and y are people. X has no money, y has $1, X isn't rich. Well, then Y isn't rich either. Okay? In other words, the cutoff between the rich and the non-rich is not going from $0 to $1. Okay, and the 2 and 3, and they just keep going up. Okay? So 2 says you got two people, one has $1 and one has $2. If the first one isn't rich, the second one isn't rich. In other words, the line, you probably think there is no sharp line between the rich and the non-rich. That's what the first billion claims are saying. And then the last two claims are pretty simple. This one says, there's somebody who has no money and isn't rich, like some newborn children, all right? And the very last claim says, there is somebody, X, and they're rich, and they've got some amount of money less than or equal to $1 billion. Okay. By the way, those are American amounts. Or, just increase it to $1 trillion. I don't care, it doesn't matter. All right. Now, if you think about this for a while, and we're not going to do that, you can see that you can derive a contradiction from these claims using nothing but elementary logic, the type of predicate logic, universal instantiation, modus ponens, absolute basics. Okay? That's why the Sorites paradox is so hard. That's why it's been around forever. That's why it's so famous. Okay? Is that each one of these claims looks obviously correct once you think about it, once you understand what they're saying. And yet, you can derive a contradiction from them. Okay, so that's the power of the Sorites paradox, and that's why this is a attempted reductio of common sense, because 1 through billion and 2, these are commonsensical claims, and yet I can, just using really simple rules of logic, derive a contradiction from them. So that's a reductio. Now, with regard to this argument, there's several possibilities. One possibility is, well, at least one of these claims is false, right? That's one possibility. Okay, that would mean that there's a commonsensical claim that's false. Okay, or all the claims are true. But if all the claims are true, then there's two possibilities. One is you can derive a contradiction from them, and the other is you can't derive a contradiction from them. So those are the three possibilities. Now, it certainly looks like you can derive a contradiction from them. Again, using just the rules that you teach in predicate logic. Okay? If you can derive a contradiction from them, then, and they're all true, well, then the contradiction would have to be true as well, because that's what we mean by a sound argument. Okay? So if one of these claims is false, that means common sense is wrong. If all these claims are true, and you could derive a contradiction from them, then common sense is wrong again, because common sense says, explicit contradictions can't be true. And then the third possibility is all the claims are true, and you can't derive a contradiction from them, even though it looks like you can. And under that possibility, what that means is that there's some sort of hidden semantic structure here that we can't spot, which prevents the derivation being valid. And I'm going to go over those three possibilities again, because I know that was complicated. Okay, so here we go. Now I'm going to do what I just said, I'm going to say it again. So there's two possibilities. All of those claims, the Sorites claims, are true. Remember, there was 1 billion and 2 of them. They're all true, or at least one of them is untrue. If at least one is untrue, then a commonsensical claim is untrue. Because each one of the Sorites claims is commonsensical, in the sense I gave earlier, that people who understand them well assent to them. Almost everyone does. Okay? If all of them are true, then the derivation of a contradiction from those claims is either valid or it's invalid. Those are the only two possibilities. If it's valid, then the derived contradiction has to be true, because we're saying that all the premises are true and the argument's valid. So that's a rejection of common sense as well, because common sense says that contradictions aren't true. So here's the lesson so far. If at least one of the Sorites claims is untrue, some philosophical reductio is successful. If all the Sorites claims are true and the derivation is valid, then we have a successful reductio of common sense again. And then we have the third possibility. What if all the Sorites claims are true and the derivation is invalid, even though it looks transparently valid, just using simple rules of predicate logic? Okay, so this is the question that I'm going to focus in on right now. Right, if all the Sorites claims are true and the derivation is invalid, even though it looks valid, then there's two possibilities. One is the derivation is formed correctly according to the rules of inference, but those rules are not truth-preserving. So for instance, modus ponens is not truth-preserving, or universal instantiation is not truth-preserving. Okay? That's a rejection of common sense again, because we think that modus ponens is truth-preserving, okay? Applied to simple sentences of English. Okay? Or the derivation is formed incorrectly according to the rules of inference. That means holding that the claims, the Sorites claims, have some hidden semantic structure so that the elementary inference rules don't apply in the obvious way. So there's no successful reductio of common sense. But again, what that means is, going back to these claims, that these claims are not what they appear to be. Like number one, it looks like a universal quantification, right? For all x, for all y, blah, 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 blah. Okay? And this one, it looks like an existential quantification. There exists an x such that blah, 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 blah. Okay? Under this last possibility, we're wrong about those things, at least somewhere. Okay. Right, so that's this claim. Okay. And I'm going to call this the semantic hocus pocus possibility. That there's all this hidden semantic structure which is fooling us, it's screwing us up. We think that this derivation is valid, and it's not. Okay, so we're making these bad mistakes. Again, we're not making bad mistakes in like, higher order intentional logic, all that sophisticated stuff. No, we're making bad mistakes in predicate logic. Okay, so here's our lesson so far. Either some reductio of common sense is successful, or the semantic hocus pocus possibility is actual. Okay, so now I'm done with the Sorites paradox. I could have done the exact same thing for the liar paradox and a whole bunch of different problems in philosophy, the statute of lay problem, all these different ones. Okay? Again, you can put a lot of, this is one of the reasons I love philosophy, is that you can take a lot of philosophical problems and you think about it, you can formulate them as a series of claims, each one of which looks right, and yet they're jointly inconsistent. Okay? And some people will say, well, this is the false one, other people say, no, it's this is the false one, and there's all that stuff. But the beauty of it is, here's like almost a proof that this is an interesting philosophical problem. Because you got a bunch of claims, each one looks true, and yet they can't all be true. Right? So it's almost like an argument for the work of philosophy. Okay, so we can do this for lots of attempted philosophical reductios. So with regard to, how many dozens of attempted philosophical reductios are there? Okay. Maybe there's 100, maybe there's 10, how many are there? For each one, this is the lesson. Either we have a successful attempted philosophical reductio of common sense, or there's this semantic hocus pocus going on that's screwing us up. That's the lesson for each one of the attempted philosophical reductios. Okay, so here we are. So here's our situation. We are faced with many attempted philosophical reductios of common sense. For each one, either the reductio is successful or the semantic hocus pocus possibility is actual. So now, here's the good question here. What are the odds that at least some of the reductios are successful? Are they high or are they low? And you could just ask yourself that. With regard to each one, you could just say, here's the Sorites paradox. What are the odds that it's semantic hocus pocus? What are the odds that it's not? And there's a successful philosophical reductio. You just ask yourself that. Or we could take a poll. We could ask all the experts on the Sorites paradox and say, what do you think? What are the odds that it's semantic hocus pocus? What do you think the odds are that it's not, and it's a successful philosophical reductio? When I'm asking about the odds, I mean kind of like the same thing like when a scientist is doing an experiment and someone asks her, well, what are the possibilities? And she says, well, either the sample contains nitrogen or it contains iron. And then you ask her, well, what do you think the odds are it's nitrogen? What do you think the odds are it's iron? That's the type of question I mean when I'm thinking of this. What are the odds? Okay, so right now I'm going to argue that the odds are high. Okay? And if you don't think I'm right, that's fine. Because after this I'm going to say, all right, suppose everything I just said is wrong and the odds are actually low. I don't care what the answer is. I just don't care. Well, I do. But for the sake of this argument, for the sake of arguing for my thesis, it doesn't matter what the answer is. Okay. But right now I'm going to argue that the odds are high. That at least one of these philosophical reductios is sound. So we have a successful philosophical reductio of common sense. Okay, so either a reductive common sense is successful, so it's a sound argument against common sense, or the semantic hocus pocus possibility is correct. Now, suppose, just for the sake of argument, the odds are small that any given attempted reductio is successful. For each one, there's an 80% chance that the semantic hocus pocus option is right. Okay, so we look at the liar paradox and we say which possibility is right? Semantic hocus pocus or successful reductio of common sense? And we ask the experts, or you ask the voices in your head, either way, and suppose you answer, well, semantic hocus pocus like 80%. Okay. That's an 80% chance. And suppose you do that for all of them, all the attempted philosophical reductios of common sense. Now, just to give you a sense of the numbers, suppose there's 20 attempted philosophical reductios of common sense. And for each one of the 20, the odds are 80% that the semantic hocus pocus possibility is right. Then you can do a calculation. Okay? It's bullshit, but I'm going to do the calculation and then I'll explain why it's bullshit. Okay? So here's the calculation. For a group of 20 attempted philosophical reductios, provided they are mutually independent, there's a 99% chance that at least one of them is successful, which means there's a 99% chance there's a successful philosophical reductio of common sense. And if you're interested, the calculation's down here. It's 1 minus 0.8 to the 20th power. All right, now the reason this is a bullshit calculation is, I hinted at it in the italics here, provided they are mutually independent. Okay, in order for this calculation to work in probability theory, each one of the arguments has to be independent of one another, which is not true. Okay? It's not true. Like, when you look at the liar paradox and you look at some of the other logical paradoxes, they kind of look like they're the same thing. They don't really look that different. Okay? Or same thing in metaphysics, all these different areas. Okay. Okay, so that means that this calculation doesn't really work. But I'm going to describe a way around this problem. Right, so are there 20 mutually independent philosophical reductios? And considerations go both ways. Okay, so think about it this way. Here's one of the favorite things philosophers like to do. They like to say, well, my argument, suppose I'm a philosopher mind, I've got an argument for property dualism. Okay? What's the first thing I'm going to do? I'm going to say, mine's different from Chalmers's, and mine's different from Frank Jackson's, mine's different from so-and-so and so-and-so, right? That's what I'm going to say in my article when I publish it. Because if I just say, oh, well, mine's just a version of David Chalmers, well, then it's not going to be published. Okay? No one's going to care. All right? So everybody likes to think that their argument's really special. Right? If you have that attitude, then you're going to say that there's tons of philosophical reductios, like hundreds. Attempted philosophical reductios. So 20 is just way, way too small. Here's another reason to think that the number 20 is too small. As a matter of more objective fact, when you look at these attempted philosophical reductios, you see that they really do rely on different principles. So take the arguments for radical skepticism. Right? Sometimes they work, they use the evil demons, sometimes dreams, sometimes brains and bats. These are different. They're importantly different. Okay? And even if you just stick with brains and bats, there's commonly accepted that there's two importantly different ways, importantly different premises that the radical skeptic uses. So if you dive into all the details, it's really tempting to say that there's hundreds. I don't know if there's hundreds, dozens at least, of attempted philosophical reductios that are, in some sense, importantly different. But on the other hand, I say considerations go both ways. I also kind of want to say that, look, all those arguments for radical skepticism, they're more or less the same thing, more or less. And all those arguments in philosophy logic, there's the liar paradox, and then there's all these other paradoxes. They're all pretty much the same thing. And you can say the same thing about metaphysics. I assume you can say the same thing in applied ethics and all these other areas. So there's really no way to count philosophical arguments. It's just really hard. Like, is this one importantly different from this one that it counts as a separate one? I don't want to get into that, okay? I can't do it. So what I'm going to do instead, and this is, I think, this isn't the first questionable move I made, but here's one that I'm going to flag, okay? I'm going to not answer this question, and I'm going to offer a model of the situation. Okay? So basically what I'm going to say, I don't know what I'm going to say. What did I say? You can model the situation with an assumption that there's just 10, but they're mutually independent, anti-commonsensical, philosophical reductives in all of philosophy. And each is only about 20% likely to be successful. And that strikes me as pretty conservative. I mean, you could say, well, look, we've got the philosophical reductives of common sense in ethics and epistemology, metaphysics, philosophy of language, philosophy of mathematics. You're like, well, these are pretty independent of one another. All right. So there's got to be at least 10 of them. So I'm just offering a model here. And again, I'm trying to be kind to common sense by saying that each one of these attempted reductives of common sense, there's only a 20% chance it's true. And again, what do I mean by 20% likely? I mean, like the scientific example I gave earlier, where we asked the scientists, what are the odds that you think it's going to be nitrogen or iron? Okay, well, if you do the calculation, it's 89%. There's an 89% chance that at least one of these philosophical reductives is successful. Okay, so that means that there's a damn good chance, 89 means damn good chance, right? That there are philosophical reductives of common sense that are completely successful. I haven't told you what any of them are. I've just said that there's enough of them that are more or less independent of each other that that's the reasonable thing to believe. All right, so that's that. And there's the argument I've given. There are at least 10 strong, mutually independent, attempted philosophical reductives of common sense. For each one, the odds of success are about 20%. That's the conservative assumption. Then there's a high likelihood that there are successful ones. If you change this 20% to like 50%, then it goes to like over 99% likely. If I remember it, if there's 20 of these, and they have a 50% chance of being right, then the odds that at least one is successful is like 99.999% or something. That's just the way the numbers work. By the way, those numbers, let's see, where was that? Yeah, this type of calculation here. This is the type of calculation you use to show that if you have like 25 people in a room, the odds are about 50-50 that 2 people have the same birthday. It's that type of calculation, if you've heard of that before. Okay, now, next step, the Moorean move. Suppose I'm right so far, that B is correct. There's a high likelihood that there are successful philosophical reductives of common sense. Then is making the Moorean move a reasonable thing to do now? Okay. Is it reliable? That's another way to put it. Not exactly the same thing. Remember, the Moorean move is you're presented with an attempted philosophical reductive of common sense, and you say, okay, it failed. I think it's a failure. And then you go searching for the weak spot in the attempted reductio. But now we've learned that there's a very high likelihood that some of those reductios are successful. So is making the Moorean move reasonable, yes or no? And I'm going to answer yes, and I'm going to answer no. The yes answer is just because the Moorean move isn't guaranteed to avoid the dismissal of a successful reductive of common sense, because it fails once, perhaps, that hardly means one should give up the move. I mean, if the Moorean move is the right thing to do 90% of the time, well, that's a pretty good track record. Okay, so that might make you think the answer is yes. But I'm going to argue that the answer is no. Okay. And here's another, now I'm going to flag another weak spot in my argument. Okay, so let me go back to, what do I want to go back to? The common sense thing. Yeah. Okay, so this list here. If I know, or if I just believe, that there's a really high likelihood that one of these is false. At least one of these is false. At least for me. I'm just talking about myself. I'm going to think, holy shit, common sense sucks. I'm going to be really wary about common sense from now on because each one of these just looks so obviously correct. And the idea is if I'm wrong about this, I could be wrong about just about anything. Right? It would be like finding out that your best friend votes for Donald Trump. I don't know, something like that. Suppose you had a friend, yeah, okay, this is a good example. Suppose you've got a friend and you think this friend, you thought you understood the politics of this friend of yours, okay? That they were, more or less progressive, maybe sort of centrist, like the Clintons or something like that. But you thought you had a good take on them. And you thought you understood their views about, the Supreme Court and abortion and all that stuff. And then you find out that it's a totally rabid Donald Trump supporter, okay? You would be like, oh my God, I could be wrong about anything about this guy, okay? About my friend. I'd be like, wow, man, am I wrong? If I'm wrong about that, I could be wrong about, maybe he's a racist, probably. Or he's just way off the charts, misogynistic or whatever. You would be in doubt about, you'd have like really serious doubts about the rest of your beliefs about your friend. I kind of feel, this is just biography here, I'm not giving you an argument. I feel the same way about this. If I'm wrong about one of these, then I just don't trust common sense anymore. Now, there's various moves we can make here. Like you could say, well, these are from common sense in real life, and these are common sense in like philosophy, and maybe you want to draw a distinction there. That's cool, we can talk about that in the Q&A. All right, so let's see, where was I? Right, okay. So, here's my claim. So this is just Bryan biography. Just consider the commonsensical claims and questions about trees, rich people, modus ponens, contradictions, and stuff like that. At least for me, I think it's no longer reasonable to keep making the Moorean move because what I've basically shown is that, or what I've basically learned, is that common sense has made some amazingly bad mistake. Okay? So I can't trust it anymore. Just like the friend of Donald Trump. Now, let's pretend that everything I said is wrong, right? And let's pretend that this premise A in my argument is false, okay? Remember, premise A said there's at least 10 of these mutually independent philosophical reductios of common sense. Each one, the odds of success are 20%. Let's pretend I'm wildly off by that, okay? Maybe the 20% figure we should say is like 1%. There's only a 1% chance that one of these reductios of common sense is successful. And the Moorean move is now reasonable. Okay, yay. All right. I'm going to argue, okay, so I've got the question, what follows? I'm going to argue that this is worse than the previous one. I'd rather be wrong about common sense and no longer engage in the Moorean move than do this next thing. I think this is the worst possibility. But again, that's just biography. I'll give you a little bit of argument for that later. Okay, so this is what this means. If the 20% figure is wildly inflated, so the answer is really like 1 or 2%, then the semantic hocus pocus response has got to be the true one virtually every time, because those are the only two possibilities. That's what we proved earlier. For each attempted philosophical reductio, there were two possibilities. One is you can form a sound argument against common sense, a successful reductio, or there's all this semantic hocus pocus going on. So what we're saying now is the semantic hocus pocus response is true every time, or virtually every time. Okay. So in virtually all those reductios, there were semantic complexities that meant that the apparent inconsistencies were merely apparent. In virtually all cases, the commonsensical claims don't have the semantics they appear to have, even when they appear to be very simple sentences, like in the Unreliable paradox. I've got 4 slides at the end with 4 different attempted philosophical reductios. So we can look at those if you want. But they are, I mean, they're simple sentences. They're not complicated things. They're not like counterfactual conditionals with impossible antecedents or weird shit like that. They're just, pretty simple sentences. Okay. Hence, there's a semantic complexity that's very well hidden, and that renders an enormous number of apparently straightforwardly valid philosophical arguments invalid. That's the validity thing. Okay? You look at the Sorites claims and you're like, oh, well, you can derive a contradiction from them. No, you can't. You look at the liar paradox and say, oh, look, you can derive that contradictions are true. No, you can't. Okay? You look at the skeptic's argument and you say, oh, those premises entail that I don't have hands. No, they don't. Okay? You're making a mistake all the time in your philosophizing. Okay? You think that this argument's valid. No, you don't know that because there's all this semantic complexity that you don't know anything about. Now, for some, just pick arguments for radical skepticism. Over the last quarter century, a lot of people, not a lot, some epistemologists have said, yeah, that's right. Okay? The skeptic's argument for radical skepticism, it is invalid. There's all this semantic complexity to it, and that's why epistemology and the philosophy of language have overlapped a lot over the last quarter century. Whereas with regard to certain other areas, like in metaphysics and such, there doesn't seem to be any of that indirect evidence for that. Okay, but now, so that's the problem. How do we know that our philosophical arguments are valid? Okay. So you write your essays, you're really careful, I've numbered all my premises, it's pretty obvious that it's valid. Well, no, it's no longer valid now. I mean, you can't be sure, you can't even be very confident at all that your arguments are valid. Okay? Never mind whether your premises are true. Okay, so back to the conclusion. You get to choose your poison here. Okay? The first option was the Moorean move is no longer reasonable, and the odds are high that there are successful philosophical reductives of common sense claims like there are trees. Modus ponens, the truth preserver. And then the other one is, the odds are low that there are successful philosophical reductives. But we are unreliable at spotting validity in our own arguments. And if that's the case, then I think we should all just switch to the philosophy of language. Because what this means is we don't understand like the truth conditional structure of our own claims anymore. So we don't know what's valid, we don't know what's invalid. Think about it this way. Here's what would be really frustrating for you if this is the way things are. You come up with, suppose you're criticizing somebody, okay, some famous person, all right, and you come up with an argument against their thesis, and you've numbered each premise, and it's just beautiful. You've worked on this for 3 years, all right, and you finally encounter big famous superstar philosopher, okay, and you go over each premise, over dinner or whatever, and he or she says, you know what, all your premises, yeah, I totally agree with them. And you're like, you're really excited now, right? Because you're like, well, they validly infer that your conclusion's false. And they're like, no, I don't think so. Why not? Well, we really suck at spotting validity, so I'll bet there's some hidden stuff going on. What are you going to do then, other than like strangle them, or give up philosophy or whatever? I think what you would need to do there is do some philosophy of language and see if there's some decent evidence that there's some sort of hidden structure there in the claims that shows that your argument is actually invalid, even though you thought it was valid. Okay. Is that it? Yeah, that's it. So we're either unreliable in truth or we're unreliable in validity. This is just a bumper sticker that's supposed to sum that up. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, so Derek, why don't you start? Everyone else keep their hands up while I go.
Okay, I really like that. So I think you can kind of build off the argument you're giving to an argument that what we should accept is that well, I wouldn't say actually you convinced me the Moorean move is no longer reasonable, just that we should accept there are successful reductives. So, I mean, once you've shown, I think you're right that it would be philosophically devastating if our intuitions about what arguments are valid are just that unreliable, like you're blank. But that's, I think, going to also create sort of meta problems for your own argument for this disjunction, right? I mean, so I
You
think
could do the Moorean move on my argument and say, well, there's a mistake in it somewhere.
Well,
I just don't know where it is.
I'm not making the Moorean move. I'm actually just saying that I think of the two disjuncts, we should accept that there are successful reductives of common sense, and I think that taking the second disjunct is actually an unstable move, because how did we argue ourselves into the position where that disjunct looked reasonable?
Yeah.
We seem to be in a self-undermining position. I just want to say that once, I wasn't totally convinced by your idea that if we allow that there's some successful reductives of common sense, we have to give up on the Moorean move altogether.
Okay.
And that's because, like, I mean, think about how many thousands, maybe millions of commonsensical claims there are, right? I mean, it's just going to be a huge number. And what you've told me is that there's like 10, 20 successful arguments out there. I mean, maybe if we're really prolific about them, you're going to get 50 or 100. I mean, I don't know, but you said a lot of these are variations on the same one, but let's be really charitable and say actually they're all, you know, special snowflakes, right? So, like, even then, that's still going to mean, okay, there's 100 commonsensical claims that I've got to give up on, right?
Here's why. When I made this list, okay, like there are trees on Earth, okay? That's not the, so I'm thinking of certain philosophical reductives in metaphysics. They don't just get you there are trees on Earth being false. It gets you just about everything is false. This is like an argument for mereological nihilism or compositional nihilism, that the only things that exist are partless things, like point particles. Okay? So it's like a lot of arguments, they don't just show that, you know, this claim is false or this claim is false, but there's just tons of them are false. It's like you can use the Sorites paradox to argue against just about anything. Okay? Material composition arguments to argue against virtually every commonsensical claim. I didn't talk about this one, some flowers are partially red. I was thinking about arguments in color theory. Okay? Anyway, so I would say that, but look, you could say, okay, in defense of what you were saying, that, okay, those arguments, the arguments for compositional nihilism, or the Sorites arguments, things like that, yeah, if they're sound, then just about everything in common sense goes, but they're not sound. Okay? The sound ones are, I don't know, arguments for skepticism, maybe, or something like that. So you might say that the successful philosophical reductios of common sense only target a small number of commonsensical claims. But that's going to be a hard move to pull off. Because how do you know which ones are successful and which ones are not?
Well, but I mean, there's a question about whether the Moorean move is generally reliable versus, you know, whether there are cases where it doesn't work, right? So it seems like I could say it just doesn't work sometimes, sure. You convinced me that. You convinced me of that. But let's, you know, I mean, to go back to your thing, if it works 80% of the time, you know, it's not a great method for detecting truth, but it's not a terrible one.
Okay, I've got two arguments against that. First of all, there's the Trump argument, okay, the Donald Trump argument, but I'm not going to give that one. The second one is what I just gave here, which is the idea that if one of these philosophical reductives of common sense is successful, it's going to show that an enormous number of commonsensical claims are false, not just a few. So that's what makes me worried.
Okay.
Okay, but let me just make, I know we have other questions, but I'll just try to endorse your view that the first horn of the dilemma, the first disjunct, is not so bad. Because look, when the metaphysician says, hey, guess what, there's no trees on Earth. Okay, at first that sounds completely bonkers, right? But then she says, okay, there's no trees on Earth, but, and then she says something to soften the blow. She says, you know, there are point particles arranged tree-wise. And that's why you think that there are trees on Earth, okay? And when the mathematical, I don't know what you call it, mathematical anti-realist or whatever, says that 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, she says, yeah, but conservative principles in mathematics, whatever the hell they are, they're fine, okay? Or some flowers are partially red. That's false, but we all see red, we all experience red under normal conditions when we look at flowers, something like that. So you can say that, look, common sense has been refuted, but only the truth of common sense has been refuted. Like the empirical adequacy is still thumbs up or something like that. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that.
Yeah, maybe I will ask question about the semantic focus. Actually, my ultimate concern is also about the variety of commonsensical claims.
Right, okay.
The question is whether if we refute some of them, even one of them, whether it's have an indication that our inference, the validity of inference fails, or how it could fail, right? So let me compare two geometric commonsensical claims. Given the Euclid geometrics 5 axioms, okay, everybody knows one of the parallel axioms. It's perfectly commonsensical if you ask anyone who even have the primitive understanding of whether the parallel line will cross. It's almost nobody would reject. But it could turn out to be, we could have an alternative axiom, right? So commonsensical difference or whatever, change at that level may not imply any fundamental, rebuttal, undermining of our, let's say, first order predicate logic.
I disagree. I
Okay.
think you're dead wrong right there. Because when someone says the parallel postulate and they state it, it's ambiguous. There's semantic complexity there. And it's a different kind of semantic complexity. It's not like equivocation or something. Well, yeah, I guess it is equivocation. Because when we say parallel lines don't meet, what do we mean? Do we mean parallel lines in space? Well, then they probably do meet, right? That's non-Riemannian geometry.
Pure geometry doesn't have to involve any physical model.
Right, that's the other
Just by
disambiguation.
it's mathematical. Okay. So anyway, I just try to use this as many people, most people take for why axiom, that parallel axiom never questioned until let's say Einstein time, compared to other things, which is more like a mathematical thing. Suppose given the Euclid, geometry, you can derive, okay, like no triangle can, round or something like no triangle could have the sum of the angles more than 180, something like that. It's a analytic, or a priori truth derivable from the system.
Right.
So that kind of truth, my certainty, my assurance about that kind of truth is not based on that intuitive acceptance like one of the axioms. Okay? The reason for that is as long as I accept these axioms
Yeah.
through the rule of inference, I can derive it.
Right.
So whatever doubt I may possibly have about the whatever the axiom may not apply to the doubt that, let's say, no triangle is round. So I can be perfectly 100% sure that no triangle is round. With different reasons. It's not based on the same reason as I may accept one day. I can even imagine that maybe parallel axiom can fail. So let alone there are so many other, millions of commonsensical claims, maybe based on very, very different ones, intuitive or others. So I just use this relatively simple one, just they are all related to some kind of math. The point is, the reason for accepting this claim related to all geometry can be very different. One is given axioms, given hypothesis, you got a result,
Right.
Yeah, that result could be never doubted. As long as you can say, I reject the system. I reject the Euclid system. That means one of the axioms. But that's a different reason from saying my intuitive, commonsensical understanding of the axiom is can be changed.
Okay.
Yeah, this is my question.
If you distinguish though between, parallel lines in space and from parallel lines in like abstract mathematical space, then you don't have an attempted mathematical reductio of common sense at all. Because you've already made the disambiguation. I'm targeting attempted reductios of common sense. But if you've already made this, it's a fairly sophisticated move that, look, there are lines in abstract mathematical space, and Euclid's talking about those. And then we have lines in physical space, and, and there's a question whether Euclid's axioms hold there.
You can construct an argument, it's not just like no plus argument. You can construct it. Especially when you give into such a broad interpretation of this so-called attempted philosophical.
Okay, but forget all the stuff about Euclid's axioms and you can derive, that no triangle is circular. Forget all that. Just think about what people's attitudes are towards applying Euclidean geometry to physical space. We can derive a contradiction there, okay? And what we give up is the idea that, we give up things like the parallel postulate. But that sounds to me like a successful mathematical reductio of common sense.
May I give you maybe a different example? It's closer to the most opponents, this kind of,
Okay, but I don't know why this matters. Are you finding a way around the discussion?
Yeah, I simply think the claim, the sweeping claim, either about all common sense, you put common sense as an umbrella term, seem to cover so many varieties, like Derek first also maybe a variety of very different commonsensical claims. Their ground is very different. The other, ask the same question from a different angle is the so-called semantic hocus pocus, bug or structure. That could be very different. For instance, if the material conditional, the validity of material conditional, or any inference based on that inference may be very different from frequently used in our daily, inference. We may be frequently use the counterfactual, condition. As
right.
David Lewis famously argued, there was no transitivity. There was no other, contraposition rule applies to counterfactual. But ordinary people may not be.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about ordinary people. I'm talking about you.
Yeah, even for me.
No.
Before
In my philosophical work,
when
I'm being really careful in my philosophical work, and I'm like, okay, here are my premises. Clearly, this follows by modus ponens. There, I'm sensitive to things like this is not a counterfactual conditional, and things like that. There isn't. It's not a causal conditional. It's not like that. I'm just like, look, this is just modus ponens. The semantic hocus pocus thing is saying we're unreliable then. I mean, in ordinary life, when we use something that looks like modus ponens, often it's not, okay? But when I'm doing this, I'm using modus ponens, and I'm using universal instantiation and stuff like that, applied to sentences of English. I mean, these are sentences of English.
But even in this particular example, the so-called semantic hocus ponens may be even more shallow than those mathematics or conditional things. People may simply think that the concept of reach is context sensitive. For Bill Gates, probably he won't agree with some of the claim like someone isn't reach because his standard or context. So somehow the semantic, things is
just stop. Okay, people who do the Sorites paradox, you can say, okay, keep the context fixed and do this. Okay, there's the context sensitivity of rich. There's contrast class type stuff going on. You don't have to use a word like rich. You can use a word like pumpkin. You can get around all those things.
It's more specific, like bold is frequently used. It's the same semantic in the sense of ordinary word, bold or rich or other. as long as they give you a specific,
It doesn't need to be a
example,
predicate.
you can always find these semantic, so-called semantic hocus pocus.
Okay, that's great. You're arguing on my behalf, you realize.
I don't think so.
Yes, you are. You're saying there's the semantic hocus pocus here that ruins the derivation.
But that is the local limited one. Even here, we can find why it's failed. It doesn't apply, this is my point, it doesn't apply to, let's say, any attempted philosophical reduction argument against, let's say, modus ponens, or against mathematical 2 plus 2 equals 4, which can never, for me, because never be refuted by the similar. I mean similar to this kind
Okay.
of so-called involving commonsensical concepts.
Right, so for some attempted philosophical reductios, you're really happy with the semantic hocus pocus thing. And for others, you're
It
not.
only demonstrates we can easily identify why it may fail.
No, we cannot easily do it.
Easily is just a way
Yeah.
of speaking, just relative to other, let's say, if anyone try to give me an argument for our first order, this kind of, predicate logic is wrong. Give me one. Compared to that, that's much harder.
Okay, that's, I'm sorry to say this, but that's your philosophical temperament. There are other philosophical temperaments who are like, you know what? No freaking way. So I'm like Tim Williamson. I'm like, no, modus ponens comes from God and things like that. And this argument comes from God as well. And that's why I'm an epistemicist. And in epistemology, you've got some people saying, look, there's just no way I don't know that I have hands. And then you've got other people who have a very different philosophical temperament, and they're like, that conclusion's actually not so bad. Okay? So, I mean, look, I'm with you that some reductios, you're going to think it's pretty clear that there's such and such semantic hocus pocus going on, and it's really not that hard to figure it out. And for other ones, no. There's definitely no semantic hocus pocus going around, and we're going to have different opinions about that. But I don't think that.
Then you have to analyze case by case rather than give so-called statistic in one order. Because you statistics, you seem to treat them as a homogeneous, kind of same kind of semantic loophole. But actually, once you accept the premise that semantic hocus pocus could be very different, categorical different, even variety, then other statistical estimation to me is true. Is not very important.
Here's why you're wrong again. You look at this argument, you think semantic hocus pocus, I'm going to say that it's 99% sure that this is a semantic hocus pocus thing. Whereas with one of the others, say, I don't know, the wire paradox, it's only 1%. Fine, go through all the calculations, it's not going to matter. My disjunction still holds.
My rule is just simply block any this kind of probabilistic kind of, because one thing is it's 100%. The other is maybe just you can prove it's wrong, and show why it's wrong. That doesn't mean it's always easy, but just it's the probabilistic interpretation here simply is not the right approach.
So we'll have to move on to the next question. We're running out of time. Prof.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if the disjunction is true, are the consequences really dramatic? In the second case, I mean, for the second disjunct, it seems the consequences are not really that dramatic if we have to do some more philosophy of language or some philosophy of logic to maybe investigate alternative logics and so on. It doesn't seem to be very, very dramatic as a consequence. Regarding the first disjunct, so that's the one that I'm maybe most concerned about, the one that may potentially have the most serious consequences. For me, it will depend on what exactly the Moorean move is supposed to be. So is it supposed to be the idea that if something contradicts common sense, then we should reject it no matter what? Or is it more like, so contradicting common sense is something like a sufficient reason for regarding an argument as unsound? Or is it more like a heuristic, something like a way in which we try to discover, so one of the ways we try to find faults with our reasoning, or is it something like a defensive strategy as you have them in science, and you don't give up your theory immediately when there's some seemingly contradictory evidence, but try
Okay.
other ways of
Right, all right.
preserving the hypothesis.
Okay, that's a good question. So what does it mean? I mean, basically what you're asking me is, what's the Moorean move really?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay? Because I take it that, you know, if presented with an argument against common sense, any kind of common sense, one of the intelligent things to do is look for a mistake in the argument. I mean, this clearly, and that's what the Moorean does. Okay? So that's obviously a good idea to do. I mean, even the person who endorses the argument is going to do that, right? They're going to say, okay, is there a mistake in the premises somewhere? Because after all, the conclusion looks nuts. I was thinking of the Moorean move as something having to do with belief. So you say that, look, I believe that this bit of common sense that this argument goes against is true. Therefore, there's a mistake in the argument somewhere. So it all has to do, it's a stochastic move about, I think that the conclusion of this argument is false because I think the common sense thing is true. So now I believe that there's a mistake in the argument, and now I'm going to search for it. So it was a stochastic thing in the sense that this is a stochastic move I'm going to make. I'm going to believe this, I'm going to retain my belief in common sense, and I'm going to adopt a new belief, which is there's a mistake in this argument.
Yeah, sometimes you add, and now I'm going to look for it. So is that somehow part of the Moorean move? And now
No, that's not part of the Moorean move. Because I take it everybody is going to look for a mistake in the argument, no matter what you think about it. Just because that's what we do for like a living.
I'm not sure that I'm convinced that this disjunction holds necessarily. It seems like it might be a false dichotomy, or there might be another move. Because when you look at these statements and you say that they're common sense, like maybe put some of the common sense statements up on the board there.
Okay.
I mean, these statements are common sense in a common context. Once you take them out of a common context and put them into a context of a logical set of premises that are 1 billion plus too long, that's no longer a context, and the statement no longer has the same meaning, it seems to me at least. So once you take them out of the common context and put them in the strict philosophical context, then saying it's not true no longer challenges my own sense of common sense.
Okay, a couple things about that. That's basically, you're doing the semantic hocus pocus response. You're saying that a claim from like ordinary life, it's kind of a Wittgensteinian move, has a different meaning, has a different semantics in philosophical discourse. So that's to say that, you know.
Maybe I misunderstood the semantic hocus pocus thing. I took the semantic hocus pocus to be saying there's some kind of functional relationship between the premises that I am overlooking, rather than just the meaning of the words within one premise is now different. Did I misunderstand that?
The semantic hocus pocus thing is saying, let me try to put it this way. It's saying that the truth conditional semantics of the claims in the reductio, we are mistaken about them. In the following strict sense, we think the argument's valid and it's not.
Okay, so I'm thinking a little bit different, I think. I'm not making a claim about the argument's validity in terms of the relationship between the premises. I'm making a claim about the meaning of one premise in and of itself. That is, it's clear about the truth or false, the truth or falsity of one premise in and of itself being different in a different context.
Okay, so you're saying that there's some sort of equivocation going on?
Yes, that's right. So for example, there are trees on Earth, and then this relates to some of the other things you said also. So of course it's common sense that there are trees on Earth, but if I now put that into a proof where I say, well, on means not in, and trees have roots, so trees are not on Earth, they are in Earth. You say, okay, well, now that it's a different context, the statement is serving a different communicative function, okay,
Sure.
maybe that's a wrong statement, but now it is no longer a common sense statement. I don't have a common sense
Right.
understanding, so now it no longer challenges, I no longer find that to be a problematic conclusion.
Right, because then now you're dealing with an argument, a philosophical argument that isn't actually against common sense anymore.
Right, so, but it seems like that same kind of move could be done against many of these statements. I guess, so in a way it is a challenge too. Is it really that bad to say that my common sense has been challenged? Like your thing with your friend with Trump, right? So if I say, well, yeah, if I believe there are trees on Earth, if I came to not believe that, that's not the same as now thinking there are no trees on Earth. It's saying, oh, maybe there is something a little bit wrong with that statement in that way,
Right,
but now
right.
it's not so bothersome.
Right. Okay, so two things about that. What you just said about how, so the trees case and the Trump case are different. In the Trump case, it really is worrisome. You're like, oh my God, okay, I really could be wrong about all sorts of things about my friend's political, moral, et cetera, views. Whereas in the tree case, you say, it's really not that bad because, okay, technically there's no trees, but there's something really close to being trees. Usually that's what people say when they're like, okay, there are successful philosophical reductives of common sense, but they're only against, like, the strict correspondence notion of truth for commonsensical claims, and it doesn't tackle the empirical adequacy of commonsensical claims. So that's to say that there are all these successful philosophical reductives of common sense, but only like the strict truth of common sense, and that's actually not that troublesome, so just relax. Okay?
I think that if you did, I think that what I would want to say is there are reductives that apply to statements that are commonsensical in certain contexts, but those reductives show that in other contexts, those seemingly common sense claims do not. I don't know if that's the same as what you're saying, sort of, but
I think you're actually looking at two different things.
okay.
Because the idea that you've got this one sentence, like there are trees, in Victoria Park or something like that. And as a claim, and when you say those words to someone, say a tourist or something like that, it's true. Okay? But when you say it in a philosophy room where we're discussing metaphysics and stuff like that, it has a different semantics. Okay? That's semantic hocus pocus. Okay? And I mean, it's basically saying that when you look at that sentence in a philosophical setting, you kind of look at it, it's kind of like you're blinking, okay? First you read it as a commonsensical claim, then you read it as a philosophical claim, and you're equivocating in your head, and you're screwing yourself up, okay? So when you think that, oh, I've got this argument against common sense, you don't really, because you're equivocating in the argument, okay? So that's kind of like what Wittgenstein, later Wittgenstein, he would probably say something like that. That, he's always talking about how words function perfectly fine in ordinary life, and then you put them in a philosophical context and everything goes haywire, right? Yeah, so that's the idea of semantic hocus pocus, on steroids, all right? And that makes it really hard to apply philosophy. I think that makes it hard to do philosophy in the sense that you have to answer the question of, well, what is the relation between, there are trees in Victoria Park as said in everyday life and said in the metaphysics room? Like what is going on there? If the meaning of the words somehow changes, or maybe it not the meaning of the individual words, but the sentence structure or something like that changes the truth conditions, then it's really hard to know what we're actually doing in philosophy at all. Also, finally, okay, my last point is, a lot of the people who are arguing against these claims, they explicitly say, I want to take the meaning of these sentences as they are in ordinary life. Very explicit about it. Okay, so they do that with the Sorites paradox and skeptical paradoxes and such like that. But anyway, I've said enough about that. So.
Is that follow-up or?
Yeah, just short. I have the feeling that, I think the argument you just applied goes, look at all those commonsensical claims. We see we have paradoxes from them, so there is some problem. Now, you just take, look at your list. You take ordinary language terms and show, oh, here are paradoxes. But when you go down your list, when those claims become more complex or more scientific in a way, I think we are encountering less and less of those paradoxes. And why is that? Because I think as soon as those terms we use are somewhat scientific, they are most of the time well-defined, And if we, you know, in one case start talking about energy hypersurfaces of phase space and stuff like that, then, you know, people talking about that stuff know what they're talking about. Those terms are defined, so they are not really running in those kinds of paradoxes like Sorites and stuff like that. So I think, maybe I understood you wrong, but I think your argument was going like, oh, look, we can show that those paradoxes arise, so they are everywhere, right? But I think, no, they are only there when we are dealing with ordinary language, and then put this ordinary language into some kind of context where we try to make a deep philosophical argument and try to take those terms as, you know, as meaning something strict and well-defined, while they actually are not, because they are just taken from ordinary language and, you know, are not really analyzed in a complex or scientific sense. I think that's where many of those problems arise.
So are you suggesting that the ordinary claims, like there are trees in my backyard or something like that, that they're semantically indeterminate, something like that, or?
Well, obviously, as you said before, and as Wittgenstein said, they work in our everyday, you know, context. But as soon as we put them in different context, in a context of philosophical discussion, then suddenly those paradoxes seem to arise. So yeah, in a sense, for everyday usage, they are well enough defined, so to say, or not defined at all, because nobody needs to define what's a tree or something. While when put in a different context, they are no longer well defined, and that's why the, so to say, semantic hocus pocus arise, or basically to say that is the semantic hocus pocus that's going on there, that suddenly we should have well-defined terms, but we're taking them from context where they are not.
Right, yeah. There's even, there's a nice paper that defends all that. It's called Vague, So Untrue by Ted Sider and David Braun. It was in use, I don't know, 10 or 20 years ago or something like that, where they basically argue that, like these claims here from more or less everyday type common sense. Okay, so there are trees on Earth. No one would say that in everyday life, but there are trees in my backyard. Okay, so something like that. That these claims are semantically indeterminate. They so they don't like arise to the level of truth. But and so one thing you can do, okay, is say that there are a bunch of, you know, persistifications of these sentences from ordinary life, and, you know, some of the persistifications are true, some of the persistifications are false, so they are not super true and they're not super false. Anyway, they go on and on about this, but their basic idea is that ordinary claims from everyday life, they're not true and they're not false in the sense of super true and super false, okay? And so it's similar to, it is semantic hocus pocus, I guess. Okay. It's saying that there's all this equivocation going on. But they're also going to say that even applies to strict science, because even in science, even in our best sciences, there's going to be some semantic indeterminacy. And you really never get rid of it. Maybe you get rid of it in mathematics with 2 + 2 = 4, but maybe not, because the addition function, and you could say that it's undefined for certain things, or you could say that it is. I don't know what else to say about that. I'm running out of steam.
That's okay.
Okay, so I've got a question, and it's kind of following up on some other questions, so it's not a completely new question. So the Trump example, right? So there's another, so there's a slightly variant on the Trump example, which is, yeah, I find out my friend one of my friends is a Trump supporter, okay? But I mean that, you might think that might reduce to a small degree my confidence in my other friends aren't Trump supporters, but it shouldn't reduce it that much, right?
Right.
Maybe it'll reduce it a little bit, right?
Right.
But still, it'll be reasonable for me to be confident that all my, that, you know, various other friends of mine aren't Trump supporters.
Derek is not.
Right. And so, like, so you might think the same thing's going on here, right? So,
Right.
so I find out that 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4, which is actually, I don't actually, I mean, I think I had found that, but that's false, right? But that hasn't reduced my confidence to a small amount that this is not true,
Right, okay.
but only a small amount, and so it's still like reasonable for me to kind of do the Moorean move in the sense that I see an argument that has true contradictions as a conclusion,
Yeah,
and so I think, well, I don't know exactly what's wrong here, but I think
sure.
one of these other things has gone wrong. I'm pretty sure that, you know, contradictions can't be true, and so I do the, you know, at least kind of Moorean
Right,
move
right.
recently. So
Maybe with not quite the certainty you had before, but yeah, I'd see that too. I mean, as a matter of fact, I think all philosophers do the Moorean move, at least. Like, okay, so, let's see. I mean, I take it that most of you in this room, I mean, if you've done a wide range of philosophy, then you're at least aware of some of the arguments that go against these claims. And some of those arguments you might actually endorse. So you're like, sunflowers are partially red. Yeah, that's actually false. Color is just, you know, in our experience or something like that. Or you might be a dialethist and say, no, contradictions, some of them are true. Okay? All right? Or, you know, etc. All right? So in some sense, you are the type of person who says, look, some reductios are successful. And you know what? I figured them out. Okay? I've been able to spot those. But when it comes to these other attempted reductios, I'm going to do the Moorean move thing. And so this is a matter of you having a certain kind of confidence in your judgment of being able to spot when you've got a successful reductio and when you don't. Okay? And now, and I didn't talk about this at all, but I think some of the arguments in the epistemology of disagreement should probably make you question whether you can be confident in your ability to spot which times you've got semantic focus, which times you don't. Okay, I don't want to say any more about that because that'll go on forever.
any other questions? Okay, well, let's thank Bryan for a great job.